Great. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Wednesday. Uh, Today's goals, I can describe the Genpei War and how it affected feudal Japan, and I can record notes from a secondary source. So today's going to be another prep day. We're covering a lot of information. There's going to be a lot of reading and listening during the lecture so that we can apply our knowledge towards a project that we are going to start tomorrow. So today's goals, you're going to be watching the lecture on the Genpei War. You are going to be answering 10 questions that are attached to this Google Classroom assignment, and then you need to make sure that you attach and submit those questions at the end. So should be pretty simple for you, but like I said, we're keeping it simple because we're going to cover a lot of information. Your assignment's going to be right here in Google Classroom. It is the one, like we said, that is titled Warriors of Japan, the Genpei War. Instructions right here. Watch the lecture, fill out the questions, turn it in. So I have two attachments here. One of them is going to be your questions, the war notes, and those are the questions you're going to fill in and attach. Was there a national military in during the Heian period in Japan? What was the vassal system? What was the Genpei War? Who fought it? Who won? What were the years for the Kamakura shogunate? And what were the names of the first three shoguns? So we've learned, remember, shoguns are those top generals. Who were regents and what power did they have? What role did Hojo Misako play in the shogunate? And lastly, who is the shogun in charge of? So who did the shogunate actually rule? And lastly, what was Bushido? That's something we've heard about before, but it's going to be particularly important by the end of this point in history. So those are the 10 questions you're going to have to answer. You can either split screen with the video, or you can go back and try and answer them afterwards. It's up to you. The other attachment is I did include a copy of the Google Slides, or the presentation that I'm going over today. Now, I'm not going to say that you can see or find every answer just by looking at the slides. You're probably going to have to listen to me explain it as well. But it is there for you if you feel like it would be easier to kind of go through and read it yourself later. So, I'm going to pull up the slides. We're going to get started. Here, you, slideshow. Neat. I'm going to bump myself down to the bottom so I am out of the way as much as possible. So, we're going to talk a little bit about Japanese military today, particularly during feudal Japan. So, when we last left off in the Heian era, remember that the big thing that we were focusing on was culture. It was art. They were not a very military-based society. In fact, when we think about Japan's military today, are they strong? Are they powerful? We know that Japan is a very advanced country. Today, they don't actually have a military of their own. They gave up that right just after World War II. They abolished their own military, and all they have now is a self-defense force, kind of like a glorified police. And, they can defend themselves in a war if they have to, but they don't have a standing military. They don't have soldiers in Japan anymore. Now, what we're looking at, remember, is the Heian era. And when we look back at the Heian military, it was kind of similar. Remember, we've learned about this idea of feudalism. That's where the emperor was in charge, and he had all of these people titled courtiers, which were the nobles, the rich people. And there was two kinds of courtiers. There was two kinds of nobles. There were nobles that lived in the capital, in the city, and they went to school. They had a good education. They learned about math. They learned about literature and writing. They learned a lot about religion, and they were considered, very sophisticated. And they were in the center of Japan. Now, on the outskirts of the empire, on the outside, out in the country, there were still nobles, but they were considered the nobles from the provinces. They were less cultured. They were considered less civilized. A lot of the times these nobles had been soldiers or warriors in the past and had kind of earned their their respect and their power through battle. And the reason that these courtiers on the outside were, put on the outskirts of Japan was because a lot of the time they would be expected to pick up and, fight for the shogun or the emperor if any barbarians or invaders tried to attack Japan. So they were put along the borders for that reason. Now, because all of these nobles were the people that had soldiers, because these nobles were the ones that would rise up to fight for the country, Japan didn't actually have its own military at the time. It did not have a bunch of soldiers sitting in the Capitol building and waiting to defend the emperor. So, under feudalism, they have what is called a vassal system. And a vassal system, it's pretty important. It is this idea that everyone serves the emperor. The emperor is the ruler of all of Japan. And what the emperor does is the emperor gives land to all these nobles. He gives them a place to put their castles. He gives them farmland where the subjects and the peasants have to live, and they have to grow crops for him or her. And in exchange, the courtiers, they owe service, so they owe military service. So all of these different nobles and their families would, live on these giant estates. They would live in areas the size of villages or cities. And in exchange, if the emperor ever needed them for something, they would have to answer. They would have to go and kind of repay his favor to them. Now, two very important families from feudal Japan are these two in yellow here. So two of these families, the Taira and the Minamoto families, their specialty, the thing they were really good at, was warriors. They trained some of the best archers in Japan. They had soldiers that could ride on horseback and fire bows and arrows and still hit their target. They were some pretty scary families. In fact, those were the two families that were almost always called on when the emperor needed to go to war with, invaders. Now, the emperor's court, the people who lived with him in the capital, they almost always got to decide what land was used for, which nobles got to live where, who got to live in the best castles, where shrines or Buddhist temples could be built, where farms could be. So really, whoever owned the most land had the most power. So whatever you could do to get the emperor to, give you more property, you would try it. It was your best interest to do so. Now, we have a structure here. We have the hierarchy, the social pyramid, and we've seen this before, but I want to go over it again just so that we remember, because we're going to be using a lot of these terms today. So at the very top is the emperor. One man, he was considered the very top of Japanese society. But remember, he was a figurehead. His job, smile and wave. I'm important. Look at me. I rule the empire. Listen to everything I say. And, they let him do that because the Japanese people, like a lot of other civilizations during this time period that we've studied, they believed that the emperor could communicate or was a descendant from the gods. They didn't want to make the gods mad. They didn't want to make the emperor mad. They let him sit there, smile and wave, emperor, smile and wave. So on the second stage here, we have the people that were actually in charge. We have the daimyo and the shogun. And the daimyo, those were those wealthy landowners. Those were those nobles, the courtiers that got to aid the emperor or give him, advice on all of the things he did. They owned those chunks of land where everyone else had to work. And the most powerful daimyo of all was the shogun. And remember, the shogun was important because he was the head of all of Japan's military. As the most powerful daimyo, he got to make all of the decisions that were made for the soldiers. And really, he was considered the actual ruler of Japan. Now, the daimyo and the shogun were in charge of these folks below them, the samurai. And the samurai's job was, in exchange for, being able to live on a farm, in exchange for being given a house, in exchange for being given money, they would have to answer to whatever daimyo was in charge of them. And, they were tied to the daimyo by a code of honor. So they were very strictly forced to listen to and respect their leader. Now, underneath the samurai were the very largest group, the peasants. And the peasants did a lot of things. They grew crops, specifically rice, but also other things, other vegetables and fruits. There was also the artisans who produced things. We see an image of somebody making pottery right here, and next to him we have someone crafting a sword. And at the very, very bottom were the merchants. And remember, those merchants, they were considered less important than everyone else because merchants didn't produce their own things. They didn't earn their own wealth. They got their wealth by selling other people's stuff, and that was not considered honorable in Japan. So now that we remember the hierarchy, who was in charge, who was not in charge, let's keep going. Now, I want to talk about what is actually considered one of the most important wars in Japanese history, and that is the Genpei War. And it took place from 1180 to 1185 CE. So, towards the end of the Heian era. And it was a civil war. Those two families we mentioned earlier, the Taira and the Minamoto families, they started to disagree about who was allowed to be in power, who should, take control and be the shogun, who should be the most powerful family in the country. And because of that, they decided they wanted to duke it out, figure out who was better. And who we're going to focus on right now is the leader of the Minamoto family. And his name was Minamoto Yoritomo. And he was considered one of the most respected people in all of Japan, partly because his family was very famous, but also because his father-in-law was a gentleman named Hojo Tokimasa. And Hojo Tokimasa was the chief advisor to the emperor, and he lived in the capital city. So he was considered, one of the most respected or powerful politicians in the country. So Yoritomo, his goal is to create, his own government, his own, way of life where the government is for warriors, by warriors. The samurai are who are in charge, and they get to make all of the decisions. That is his goal. And if he wins this civil war, he's going to do whatever he can to make sure that the country is ruled by, the soldiers, ruled by the samurai, not by the nobles like we've seen so far. So at the end of the war, the Minamoto family wins. The Taira family is almost completely obliterated. Their soldiers are all gone. Some of the elders and the family members are still left, but they've lost most of their power. And Minamoto's new government, they very quickly go through and they try and kill or defeat all of their enemies. Anyone who doesn't like them throughout Japan is kicked out or murdered. And this Genpei War and how it ends actually is the plot of one of the most famous stories in all of Japanese history, one that we're going to look at tomorrow, called The Tale of Heike. So it's kind of a story of the Civil War and all of the bloodshed and the fighting that led to the Minamoto family taking over Japan. And there's actually, we're going to see a lot of these, but a lot of the history we've learned from this comes from these images right here. These paintings that tell the stories of these battles. So here you can see, two sides fighting on ships with swords and arrows in the middle of a storm. I absolutely love the artwork from a lot of these pieces. All right, continuing. What these pieces of art are called, they're called imaki. And imaki are very particular because they include two different things. They include a painting from, one of the scenes of a story, and they also include quotes from the story. So if we look very carefully at one of these imaki, let's look at the one on the right here, this gentleman hiding in the corner. So this would be from a scene from a story. And what they do is they take quotes from that story, maybe 3 or 4 lines from a specific page. And you can see that they write them directly on the artwork. and they draw or paint a picture that represents those words. It's almost like a storybook. So if you pay attention to these, they're almost like scenes or pages from a storybook about Japanese history. And once again, these are called imaki, and they are one of our primary sources for how we have learned about all of this Japanese history, because this is one of the most popular ways that things were written down. Once again, we have characters from the story. We have battles right here, whether they be between two people in a duel or between several people. And we have, once again, they literally copy and paste the text from the story on the side so that you read it, but you also see it. So, the Minamoto family has won this war. Yoritomo has led his family to victory. And the Genpei War ended in 1185 and became the start of the Kamakura Shogunate. That was the name of Yoritomo's government. And the Kamakura Shogunate started in 1185, ended in 1333. And shortly after it started, Minamoto Yoritomo, this famous general, this guy that led his family to win this civil war, he became the shogun. He became the most powerful general in all of Japan, which means that he can try and start his dream of, this government run by the military, for the military. Japan will become more tough. They'll become stronger. They'll become more independent. They won't be, soft and goofing off all the time like when the nobles were in charge. Now, at the time, there were two really important families involved in Japanese government. There was the Minamoto family. They were considered great still because they were a military family. They founded this first shogunate, this dynasty where the shogun was always in charge. They were the winners of that Genpei War, the Civil War. The other popular family at the time was the Hojo family. And the Hojo family consisted of the members of the Taira family that, weren't killed in the war. So that losing side, since they were no longer a military power, since they no longer had any soldiers, they started to become advisors instead. One of the leaders of the Hojo family became married to Minamoto Yoritomo, the shogun, and they became what's called the regent family. And the regent family means that this family was, once again, the group that became the closest advisor to the shogun. So whoever the regent was, the head of this clan, they got to give advice and weigh in on all the decisions of Japan and tell the shogun what they thought was correct. So really, this regent was one of the most powerful people in the country, almost as powerful as the shogun himself. There we go. So let's talk a little bit about Minamoto Yoritomo and how he started his government. So the first three shoguns, the first three rulers of the Kamakura clan shogunate were Yoritomo himself. Now, he was not the shogun for very long. He resigned, he retired in 1195, and 4 years later he died in a horse riding accident. And his job was taken over by his son, Yorie. And it was Yoritomo's oldest son. He was only in charge for about a year, though. And shortly after, he tried to retire and he was assassinated. He was killed by a rival family who didn't like the way he was making decisions and, wanted to take power away from him. He was quickly replaced by Yoritomo's second son, Sanetomo. And he was a ruler a little bit longer, about 16 years. But eventually he was assassinated too by his own nephew who wanted to take power from him. So, not even family was close enough to keep people from trying to take over here. Yikes. remove this. We have all kinds of cool pictures and paintings and artwork. There's been lots and lots of films and movies made about the Kamakura shogunate and the Genpei War. So that's kind of what we're seeing in the sides here are movies based on these events. So let's talk about regents. Regents, once again, were those advisors. In fact, the regent was the chief advisor to the shogun, the person who gave him all of his advice. And at first, the regent was from the Hojo family, a man named Hojo Tokimasa. Eventually, he was pushed out of power or removed by his kids, Yoshitoki and Masako. So Yoshitoki was his son, and Masako was his daughter. This is actually from two different films. These are actresses who played the character of Hojo Masako to the right here, and she was actually the first shogun's wife. When we talk about the first shogun of the Minatomo family, his wife was this woman here, and she was quite the schemer. She was always trying to stay in the background and advise, tell the shogun what to do. Told him when she wanted him to retire. Tried to influence who was in his court, and she was really, she was playing games in the background trying to kind of run Japan through her influence. So after she kicked her father out, she put her brother in charge. And he was in charge for a while after he had forced his dad into retirement, but was removed once again. Once Hojo Masako was tired of him, she kicked him out again and put her nephew, his son, into power. Whoever will listen to her the most was who was put as this chief regent of Japan. So the shogunate government, let's talk a little bit about what they were in charge of. Now, we talked about how it was a government by warriors for warriors. Soldiers were supposed to be in charge. And that sounds really cool, but in the end, the only people the shogun actually had any power over were the other samurai, the other soldiers. The shogun didn't really have any control over the nobles that lived in the capital, didn't really have any control over the other daimyo. So at first, the shogun was considered, the most powerful person in the country, but eventually he started to lose that figure, or that symbol, that role. Eventually, he started to become a figurehead, a symbol, just like the emperor. A council was set up to advise the shogun. Some of the most powerful daimyo in the country would gather around the capital. They would come in, they would give him advice just like the regent did. And this group of daimyo and the regent actually started to take control of Japan because they would meet together, they would decide how they wanted the country to be run, and then the regent would go and say, hey, this is what we need to do. We've talked about it a lot. This should be what's going on. And the shogun would just shake his head and say, you know what, that sounds good. I'm going to listen to you guys. You all seem smart. Let's go for it. And because of that, these nobles, these daimyo, slowly started to take control of the country. Now, we're talking about this warrior class. We're talking about this government, made by warriors for warriors. And one of the most important things to mention, we've talked about it before, is how this Bushido code started to become law, started to become the way of life. And because of that, some of the most important things in Japanese culture, things like loyalty, things like being frugal, that means, not having a whole bunch of stuff, living with very little physical possessions, became very important characteristics. Warrior values became more important than court values. So instead of, art and music or poetry being popular in schools, you started to learn the art of warfare. You started to learn about combat instead. And this obsession with being honorable all the way to death became very popular at the time. So this idea of soldiers, almost demanding that they get a death on the battlefield. They didn't want to, die at home in a bed. They wanted to die with their sword in their hands, became a way of life. And as we see this idea spread, we're starting to get closer and closer to what we've learned about in, the feudal Japan era, where these samurai were fighting each other. They were going to all these civil wars, and we're starting to get closer and closer to this Japanese culture we see in movies and in comic books and manga and stuff like that. So this really is leading to what we would consider the stereotypical samurai. All right, so that's all I have for the notes today. You need to make sure you have all 10 of those questions answered. If it wasn't written down directly on a slide, I mentioned it at some point in time during my lecture. Remember that you need to submit your work with the Google Docs attached to get your points. Please remember that I need something turned in by 2:55 today to get credit on your assignment and to be marked as present. If you don't get the whole thing done, try and get it turned in to me by tonight. I will be putting grades in the grade book tomorrow, Thursday. So that's going to be the game plan for that. And remember, this lecture and these slides are going to be a really good reference for you, because tomorrow we're going to be reading the Tale of Heike, an excerpt from it, and you are going to have to be designing and making your own works of art similar to what we saw in the slides. So keep track of what you learned, remember, because you're going to have to draw some inspiration from it. Have a great day. Let me know if you have any questions. Stay safe. See you later.